The best days for the Russian army in the war against Ukraine are already behind it. This is the prediction made by James J. Carafano, an expert in national security, foreign policy, and defense, in a column for the American online analytical magazine 1945. He pointed out that Putin had failed to achieve his strategic goals in Ukraine. And although the fighting could continue for months or even longer, he will no longer be able to achieve this, as the Russian army has passed its climax. The author writes that when this climax occurs, the advantage shifts from the attacking force to the enemy. The war will formally end when Putin votes to leave. Forecasters can predict anything, but only the man in Moscow knows when enough is enough. At the same time, there are realities that Russians will have to come to terms with, he writes. He believes that, whatever the outcome, Ukraine will remain an independent European state, one of the most important from an economic and military standpoint. This is primarily due to its battle-hardened, largest army in Europe. Furthermore, Ukraine now possesses one of the most productive and innovative defense industrial bases in Europe. And demand for Ukrainian products will grow, he predicts. In the New World, a defense industrial base is part of conventional deterrence. And countries that demonstrate the ability to wage protracted war, maintain critical infrastructure, and produce weapons and ammunition become less attractive enemies. Ukraine will become a formidable prey for any potential aggressor. After the war ends, he believes, Ukraine will become a key player in Europe, ensuring food security and extracting unique minerals. He also doesn't rule out Ukraine becoming part of the supply chain for semiconductors, critical minerals, and artificial intelligence. It will also integrate into the regional maritime shipping network, as Ukraine has displaced Russia from most of the Black Sea. He notes that the US is not ready to abandon Europe and NATO completely, otherwise Trump would have left long ago. He also believes that it was under President Trump that Ukraine achieved its most impressive successes, while Russia suffered its most serious failures. The last year, he recalled, has demonstrated Russia's vulnerability to deep strikes. Meanwhile, NATO is building a system of offensive and defensive defense. They are purchasing weapons that are also capable of striking Russia, and are also building European air defense, missile defense, and anti-drone defense systems. At the same time, the Russian dictator will attempt to destabilize, intimidate, and discourage his opponents. The author suggested that Russia should expect not only open warfare, but also political, economic, and hybrid wars, as well as transnational crimes and attempts to create weapons of mass destruction. These actions will occur as Putin, the master of disasters, deems necessary, but they will always be part of his arsenal, he wrote. At the same time, Putin would still gain a certain degree of legitimacy if he took on Gorbachev's role and used Russia's nuclear arsenal as a tool of influence in US-China arms control negotiations. However, success here depends primarily on China's willingness to engage in such negotiations. He also noted that Putin would need Western experience to restore the energy and digital sectors and revive the space industry. However, no one is willing to give him anything for free, so he had to be prepared to make additional demands in such negotiations. According to Russian opposition economist Vladislav Inozemtsev, economic problems are unlikely to force Russia to end its war against Ukraine, but widespread public discontent within the country or protests by a section of the elite could be a decisive factor. He noted that the experience of 2014 to 2019 showed that Russian society can tolerate a deteriorating economic situation for a long time. Specifically, Inozemtsev recalled that after the fall in oil prices, living standards in Russia fell by approximately 10%, and the ruble depreciated by almost half, yet this did not lead to mass protests. If the Russian economy continues to decline at a rate of 2% per year, perhaps in 5 years' time, someone will start to feel a bit shaky. Cataclysms like the arrival of refugees and the lack of gasoline will likely accelerate this process. But again, this will be more due to psychological difficulties than economic ones, the economist said. Inozemtsev added that the Russian state sector remains sufficiently resilient to continue the war. He noted that the authorities can continue to finance military expenditures despite declining technological development and other structural problems. At the same time, according to The Economist, small businesses and the private sector of the Russian economy are the most vulnerable, suffering from internet outages and gasoline shortages. However, he believes that economic problems alone cannot change the Kremlin's policy. This regime will only run into trouble when Russians say, well, that's no longer possible. Only through a social movement like this or some kind of elite protest can this war be stopped. But it certainly won't happen because Putin suddenly wakes up and is told that inflation has risen by 3% and the national debt by 10%. Even if he believes that, he won't believe that the serfs could rebel against the Tsar. And rarely has anything changed in Rus by any other means, Inozemtsev concluded. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin finds himself in the most precarious position of his career. This raises the question, writes CNN columnist Nick Payton-Walsh, whether Putin will dare test the alliance's strength. The author recalled that Putin's approval ratings have plummeted due to the war, and the Russian economy continues to decline. Meanwhile, Ukraine has launched a campaign of strikes against distant targets in Russia, primarily targeting oil refineries. Therefore, he believes, Putin must make a decision, whether to escalate the situation against Ukraine and its NATO allies. Concerns that Russia could open a new front in Europe are constantly being voiced. The basis for this, Avto believes, is that Putin erred in his decision to quickly win in Ukraine. Beyond all the consequences for Ukraine and Russia, this means he could continue to make erroneous decisions. At the same time, the situation in Russia is described from two perspectives. On the one hand, there are losses due to the fuel crisis, dependence on China, a shortage of soldiers, and the need to turn to the Iranian and North Korean regimes for military assistance. On the other, there is the conversion of factories for military purposes and the active propaganda of war in society, including in schools. Furthermore, there are the extremely high military budget expenditures, officially reaching 7% of GDP, but in reality, accounting for almost half of all budget revenues. At the same time, the situation in Russia is described from two perspectives. On the one hand, there are losses due to the fuel crisis, dependence on China, a shortage of soldiers, and the need to turn to the Iranian and North Korean regimes for military assistance. On the other, there is the conversion of factories for military purposes and the active propaganda of war in society, including in schools. Furthermore, there are the extremely high military budget expenditures, officially reaching 7% of GDP, but in reality, accounting for almost half of all budget revenues. Let's remember that the Russian dictator's two main strategies are considered to be an aggressive attempt to change the course of the war and limited escalation. These include continued military action in Ukraine, including an attempt to use nuclear weapons. They also include a direct or hybrid attack on NATO countries. Some Western leaders are already preparing for a Russian provocation against the Baltic states or Poland. At the same time, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the defense forces have managed to slow the Russian advance as much as possible and liberate adjacent areas of the Black Sea from the Russian fleet. He described the next stage of the war as a battle for the skies, which will be won by the more technically proficient, not by the largest territorial gains. He added that Ukraine had already succeeded in depriving Russia of victory on the ground and displacing its navy from most of the western Black Sea. Therefore, airspace had become decisive. Today, I believe that victory in this war will go to the smarter side. If we stop the enemy on the battlefield, if we stop the war on land and deprive them of their dominance at sea, as we did with our naval drones, pushing back the Russian fleet, then the next battlefield will be the skies. And the skies will determine the outcome of this war, Zelensky said, adding that in this struggle, whose territory is larger matters far less. According to him, although Russia is geographically larger and has a larger population, the war has already moved into airspace, where Ukraine is already competitive. He cited Ukraine's ability to produce and use long-range drones, which has changed the course of the war and allowed it to strike military and energy facilities deep within Russian territory. However, Zelensky pointed out one critical vulnerability that could determine the outcome of the war: air defense. There's only one unknown left. Unfortunately, that's missile defense, he said, noting that this is Ukraine's main weakness at the moment. Zelensky stated that airstrikes on both sides are proof that the war is changing and has entered a new phase. It has replaced a grueling war with a war of attrition, in which the front line moved only slightly despite the fighting. Our soldiers, with their dedication, stopped Russia on land. When the front is largely stable and the enemy can't operate freely at sea, the only option left is the air, Zelensky said. He also expressed confidence that Ukraine would be able to defeat Russia at this stage. However, there are several conditions. Partners must continue to provide financial support, and soldiers must hold the territory, as every kilometer the Russians advanced cost them tens of thousands of lives.